I've seen a lot of people walk into my courtroom over the years. Angry people, broken people, people who knew they were guilty the moment they sat down. But that Tuesday morning in January, power walked in first. Before I even took my seat, the atmosphere was wrong. Doors opened and closed too quickly. Radios whispered. Metal detectors were rolled in, where they had never been needed before. Security didn't move like court officers. They moved like this room was about to host someone who believed the law itself should step aside. That's when I saw them. Secret Service agents. Not one or two. A full sweep. Positions taken along the walls. Eyes scanning every corner of my courtroom as if justice were a threat instead of a promise. I remember thinking, this isn't protection. This is a message. And then he entered, 19 years old, towering, 6'9", dressed in a suit that cost more than most defendants earn in a year. A watch glinting under the courtroom lights, the kind of watch worn by someone who has never once worried about consequences. He didn't look around in fear. He didn't look for reassurance. He walked in like the outcome had already been decided and that decision favored him. I've seen confidence before. This wasn't confidence. This was entitlement. His eyes moved across the room, not searching for justice, but measuring how much of it he could ignore. His posture said everything before his mouth ever opened. This is a formality. This will go away. But then I looked to the front row of the gallery. Sitting there was a man with no security, no lawyers whispering in his ear, no power behind his name. A middle-aged teacher, hands folded tight in his lap, shoulders hunched like someone trying to make himself smaller in a room that suddenly felt dangerous. His glasses were taped together. Faint bruises still marked his face. And in his eyes was something I've learned to recognize immediately. Fear not of the law, but of who might come after him for using it. That contrast hit me harder than any argument ever could. On one side of my courtroom stood influence, protection, and a family name known across the world. On the other sat a citizen who believed, or at least hoped, that the law still meant something. And in that moment, I realized this case wasn't about a bar. It wasn't about a shove. It wasn't even about a crime. It was about whether power could walk into an American courtroom and expect the rules to step aside. I've sworn an oath to the Constitution, not to a last name. And as I looked at that young man standing there like consequences were optional, I knew something he didn't. By the time this day was over, one of us was going to be proven wrong. And what happened next would not just shake my courtroom, it would test whether justice still had a spine when power dared it to bend. I've seen arrogance before, but this was something different. It wasn't loud or brash. It wasn't even the swagger of youth. No, this was trained confidence, the kind that comes from knowing the world bends to your name, that rules are suggestions and consequences are for everyone else. He stood there, taller than anyone else in the room, shoulders broad, suit perfectly tailored, Rolex glinting like a spotlight on privilege. Surrounded by attorneys who had argued before the Supreme Court, agents who scanned every corner of the room for threats, and assistants carrying briefcases that could have bought a small car, he acted as though the courtroom itself existed to flatter him. And I realized something almost immediately. This wasn't a teenager who had made a mistake. This was a young man who had spent his entire life believing he was untouchable. Raised in the glare of the White House, taught by wealth and power that rules rarely applied to him, he looked at me and the law with the faintest trace of annoyance, as if I were an obstacle he could push aside with the right words or gestures. Yet, even with all that confidence, there was something fragile behind the eyes, something I couldn't yet name, a tension beneath the entitlement, a moment of reckoning waiting to unfold. And I knew in my gut, entitlement meets justice today, and only one of them leaves standing. Then I turned to the man who had no protection, no name to leverage, no army surrounding him. David Martinez, 52 years old, a high school history teacher, a man whose job was to teach teenagers about checks and balances, about the idea that no one, not even a president, is above the law. I could see it in him immediately. He had been physically hurt. His glasses were taped together. His face still bore faint bruises. But more than that, I saw courage. Quiet, steady, unwavering courage. This was someone who could have turned away, stayed silent, chosen safety over principle. And yet here he was, ready to tell the truth in front of a room full of intimidation and power. I thought about what this moment meant. Here was a man with nothing but facts, nothing but his integrity, standing against someone who had everything: influence, wealth, name recognition. And that is the measure of justice. It is tested not when the powerful behave, but when they expect to dominate. He looked small in the gallery, yes, but the law he represented made him larger than any entourage, any title, any inherited privilege. And as I met his gaze, I knew that this wasn't just a trial about one incident in a nightclub. This was about whether courage and truth could stand firm when confronted by the weight of a name that commands headlines and fear. The air in the courtroom shifted. You could feel it. A silent question hung over us all. Would the law bend, or would it hold? And I was determined to make sure it held. The incident itself might sound ordinary on paper: a crowded nightclub, a brief brush between two people, a momentary bump. But in that bump, the entire story of entitlement and accountability collided. David Martinez was carrying 2 drinks, navigating through a throng of people celebrating a retirement. He accidentally brushed against him just a touch. Nothing intentional, and in an instant, the young man towering over him reacted. He grabbed David by the collar, shoved him into a wall. David tried to apologize, tried to step back, tried to defuse the situation, but it wasn't enough. The young man followed him, knocked his glasses off, and shoved him to the ground. Drinks spilled. Patrons gasped. And then came the words that made this case more than a simple bar fight. Do you know who I am? I'm Barron Trump. My father was the president. One phone call and you're done. You'll never work again. Nobody messes with a Trump. I watched the security footage with a growing chill in my veins. Every action recorded, every gesture of arrogance, every escalation, captured in cold, undeniable pixels. The young man wasn't defending himself. He wasn't confused. He wasn't afraid. He was wielding privilege like a weapon, and he intended for everyone in that room to know it. At that moment, the law wasn't just being tested, it was being threatened. Then came the defense. The arguments you might expect when someone believes the world owes them mercy because of a last name. My client is just a college student, they said. Everyone uses fake IDs. It's blown out of proportion. They painted the assault as minor, the threats as stress-induced, the actions as forgivable because youth is messy. They even tried to argue that my courtroom should take into account the family name, implying that political prominence somehow softened accountability. I listened, and I felt the weight of history pressing against me. For a moment, I could almost hear every precedent, every principle of justice whispering in my ear. No, you cannot let a name rewrite the law. I looked at the young man. His eyes reflected the belief that rules were optional for people like him. He waved off his attorney, speaking freely, as if honesty about entitlement could substitute for responsibility. But the law does not bend. Evidence does not care who your father is. Threats do not vanish because of privilege. And when the truth is undeniable, no amount of reputation, influence, or inherited power can shield someone from the consequences of their actions. I realized in that moment this wasn't just a defense. It was a test of whether justice could withstand the arrogance of power, whether the courtroom could be a place where the law held firm, regardless of the name behind the defendant. And I knew then that my decision in the next few minutes would send a message far beyond this room. It would tell the world whether accountability still exists, or whether entitlement could walk unchecked, cloaked in privilege. When the footage played, the courtroom fell completely silent. The lights dimmed, and the screen flickered to life. Every movement, every gesture, Every word became impossible to ignore. I could see him tall, confident, surrounded by friends entering the club. The bouncer glanced at his ID, recognized the name, and waved him through. A special privilege, handed without question. Inside, the crowd shifted around him. He moved with a swagger, ordering drinks, laughing, gesturing, already intoxicated or already acting as if the rules didn't apply. Then the moment happened. David Martinez, carrying 2 drinks, accidentally brushed against him. Barely a touch. And the reaction was immediate. The young man spun, grabbed David by the collar, shoved him into the wall. David tried to apologize. He tried to walk away, but it wasn't enough. He followed him, knocked his glasses off, and shoved him to the ground. Drinks spilled everywhere. Patrons froze, unsure whether to intervene. And then, unmistakably, the words cut through the noise. "Do you know who I am? I'm Baron Trump. My father was the president. 1 phone call and you're done. You'll never work again. Nobody messes with a Trump." Even off-screen, you could feel the weight of that statement. It wasn't a threat. It was a declaration, a belief that the law did not and should not touch him. I sat back in my chair, letting it sink in. No theatrics, no exaggeration, just undeniable truth, recorded for all to see. And in that moment, the courtroom knew the stakes were real. Privilege had met principle, and principle would have its say. Then it was David Martinez's turn to speak. He didn't beg for sympathy. He didn't exaggerate. He simply told the truth. And the courtroom listened. "I'm a history teacher at Classical High School," he said, voice steady but quiet. "I've taught for 26 years. That night, I was at Club Karma for a colleague's retirement party. I accidentally bumped into someone, Mr. Trump. I apologized immediately, tried to move away. But he grabbed me by the collar, slammed me into a wall, knocked my glasses off, and shoved me to the ground. And then he said that he could destroy my career with 1 phone call." I looked around. Gasps, whispers, some faces pale. This wasn't just a story about a nightclub altercation. It was a story about fear, intimidation, and the misuse of inherited power. David continued, voice firm now, eyes locked on the courtroom. "I teach American history. I teach my students about checks and balances, about how no one is above the law. And that night, that lesson was threatened in real time. My livelihood, my reputation, my ability to teach. All challenged by someone who believes their family name grants immunity." He paused, and the weight of it hung in the room like a shadow. I reflected silently. This is why courts exist. Not for headlines, not for spectacle, but to ensure that even in the face of wealth, power, and influence, truth and justice have a place to stand. And I knew then, as I looked at both the towering defendant and the shaken teacher, that the courtroom had reached a tipping point. One side believed entitlement could shield them. The other stood armed with nothing but courage, principle, and the law. And by the time this trial concluded, the outcome would send a message far beyond these walls. In America, no one, not even a name as powerful as Trump, escapes accountability. I've learned something over the years. When someone believes they're above the law, the moment accountability gets close, they don't grow quiet. They grow bold. As the testimony ended, I watched him closely. No remorse, no reflection. He shifted in his seat, checked his phone, barely disguising his impatience, as if the truth unfolding in front of him was an inconvenience rather than a reckoning. I stopped the proceedings. I told him to put the phone away and pay attention to the man whose life he had shaken. The look I got back wasn't fear. It wasn't shame. It was irritation. That's when entitlement crossed into something more dangerous, contempt for the court itself. His attorneys tried to regain control, speaking in polished language, reminding me who their client was, hinting at appeals, at media backlash, at political consequences, not directly, never directly. But the message was clear. This case is bigger than you, and that's the oldest trick in the book. I've had defendants try to intimidate witnesses. I've had others try to intimidate juries. But trying to intimidate the court, that tells me everything I need to know about character. Because a courtroom is the last place where power is supposed to fail. I looked at him and realized something deeply troubling. He wasn't afraid of the law. He was offended by it, offended that it dared to treat him like everyone else. And in that moment, I knew this case had reached its turning point. The question was no longer whether the law had been broken. The question was whether the court would be bullied into pretending it hadn't. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't rush. Justice doesn't need volume. I reviewed the evidence carefully. The video, the testimony, the recorded threats, each piece stacked on the next until there was nowhere left to hide. Then I looked directly at him. I told him that names don't testify. Evidence does. Power doesn't decide guilt. Facts do. I found him guilty. Guilty of assault and battery. Guilty of using a fraudulent ID. Guilty of underage consumption of alcohol. And guilty of witness intimidation not because of who his father was, but because he chose to use that name as a weapon. His face changed instantly. The confidence cracked. The disbelief rushed in. And for the first time since he walked into my courtroom, reality caught up with him. He tried to speak, tried to frame it as persecution, tried to turn accountability into politics. I stopped him. This courtroom doesn't serve parties, families, or power structures. It serves the law, and the law had spoken. You could feel it in the room. The air shifted. The weight of the verdict settled in. The teacher in the gallery exhaled for the first time all day, and the young man who believed he was untouchable finally realized something every citizen must learn eventually. The law does not care who you think you are. It only cares what you've done. Sentencing is the moment everyone thinks is about punishment. It isn't. It's about boundaries. I looked at him one last time before I spoke. 19 years old, tall, privileged, surrounded by people who had spent his entire life fixing problems before consequences ever arrived. And I realized something important. If the law blinked now, it wouldn't just fail one teacher, it would teach a generation that power erases responsibility. I spoke calmly, clearly, without emotion. I explained that assault is assault, no matter the last name. That intimidation is intimidation, even when it's wrapped in political influence. That using power to threaten a citizen's livelihood is not immaturity, it's abuse. The sentence reflected that truth. The room didn't explode with noise at first. It froze. Attorneys stood in disbelief. Security shifted instinctively. And for the first time since he walked into my courtroom, the young man looked stunned. Not angry, not defiant, stunned. He tried to speak, tried to invoke his future, his education, his family. I stopped him. Your future does not excuse your actions. Your name does not shield you from consequences. And this courtroom does not answer to power. When I finished, the message was unmistakable. Entitlement had reached its limit. Within hours, the story was everywhere. Headlines screamed. Opinions clashed. Some called it justice. Others called it persecution. Powerful voices demanded explanations. Social media erupted with outrage, praise, and disbelief. But courtrooms aren't run on noise. They're run on law. Appeals came quickly. Arguments followed. And one by one, they failed. Because evidence doesn't bend. And truth doesn't care who's uncomfortable. David Martinez went back to his classroom, back to teaching history, back to telling his students about checks and balances, only now with a story they could never forget. He stood up to power, and the system held. And the young man who believed he was untouchable learned something far more valuable than immunity: accountability. I want to leave you with this. In America, we don't have royalty. We don't inherit immunity. And no family name outranks the Constitution. Justice only survives when courts are willing to stand firm, especially when power expects special treatment. especially when intimidation tries to replace law. That day, my courtroom wasn't tested by violence. It was tested by privilege. And privilege lost. If this story reminded you why the rule of law matters, if you believe no one should be above justice, if you believe courts must protect the powerless, not bow to the powerful, then subscribe to this channel, share this story, and stay with us. Because when power walks into a courtroom expecting the rules to move, someone has to remind it why the law exists.